By 1:30 a.m., or an hour and a half into the entire invasion, including the battle occurring in Waco, many combat actions had already occurred, and many changes were unfolding throughout the Waco battlefield in general, as the 68th PLA Group Army elements present within this particular AO, this whole battle space, including the 8th Independent Brigade and its comprising battalions, the 38th Infantry Brigade and its comprising battalions, which were split between the southwest quadrant of the battle space and the northwest quadrant of the battle space, and the relatively large 288th Light Infantry Division, comprised of its 13th Light Armor Brigade, 3rd Light Infantry Regiment, and 14th Light Infantry Regiment, had already made ample contact with American defending forces within the general northeast quadrant of the battlefield, as very numerous armed reactionary American civilians, including some militiamen outside of the city proper, that had been heavily shelled and then engaged by the light mechanized infantry forces with their ZBL-08 infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel carrier versions, along with their dismounted troops. After the heavy shelling had occurred against these forces, they had been surrounded and what was left of them destroyed by the Light Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 3rd here, as well as here when they were clearing the areas adjacent to I-35, with the 14th Light Infantry Regiment assisting in the clearance of I-35 from its west side of it, whereas the 3rd focused primarily on areas east of I-35. However, its battalion, after heavy rocketing from the PHL-81 multiple launch rocket systems, which were 122 millimeter, very destructive, had landed on and heavily rocketed these armed reactionary civilians as soon as they appeared and began to clump up in groups, trying to spread the word through mouth and line of sight communications, as they had no communications due to the anti-satellite and cyber strikes that kicked off the invasion, along with the electronic warfare assets that were jamming redundant communications throughout a large region that belonged also to the 68th PLA Group Army. As a result of not being able to communicate, these armed reactionary civilians that chose to stay and fight rather than flee, which would have been a more wise decision considering the circumstances, were heavily hit with everything from rocket artillery to 155 millimeter artillery, and even in many cases also 152 millimeter artillery, as the very powerful PLL-66 howitzers that comprised the artillery battalion within the 38th Infantry Brigade were firing on numerous armed civilians in the Willow Grove suburb area, as well as in the city itself and beyond, as they were helping lay down enormous volumes of fire, including against the 143rd Infantry Regiment, which was an airborne infantry regiment of the Americans, a light infantry-oriented force that was now holed up and defending the downtown area from, largely for the time being, 8th Independent Brigade elements, as their 2 armored battalions equipped with the very powerful and advanced Type 96B main battle tanks had hurriedly rolled into downtown to engage them, along with the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, one of them within the 8th Independent Brigade operating in this particular area just south of the Brazos River, had moved in, surrounded these armed reactionary civilians to clear them from I-35, before then moving with the armor on the forces that were downtown, which was comprised of armed reactionary civilians, the 143rd, and now arriving mixed American military, which was approximately 3 company-sized elements worth of mixed vehicles and troops that had originally scattered from the Fort Hood area from heavy harrying and strafing attacks from J-11 fighters and their accompanying FH-97A drone fighters that were paired with them, along with heavy artillery strikes as they fled, and Lancet 3 and CH-901A loitering munitions from the Russians and Chinese, respectively, as they had fled into the Waco battle space. They were, in most cases, deliberately let in as the other PLA units that didn't start off in Waco as Trojans and started a bit further away began arriving. They had slipped through and were allowed in before they were engaged and to be destroyed. As it was very early still in the invasion and even the fighting in Waco overall, even the air defense forces of the 8th Independent Brigade, comprised of the SP AAA 95s, were busy engaging armed reactionary civilians at this point in time, as they were also hit by heavy artillery strikes that were essentially called in with the ISR quadcopter assets of these very batteries that comprise this battalion, as they fired their quad 25mm autocannons and the ground attack roll into these armed reactionary civilians who all they could do was try to fight back with small arms, but it wasn't nearly enough. And they were forced to flee, being shelled en route, with very few making it away with their lives, as the ISR assets continued to assist in calling in precise coordinates on where they were anticipated to run to next as they ran, and relaying that back to the FDCs of the artillery forces. As these armed reactionary civilians were heavily shelled by the 152mm howitzers, the rest of the 38th Infantry Brigade was on the move within the first hour and a half, while the Americans were beginning to arrive into the area within their mixed elements. These were 2 to 3 companies in size, each of these icons, which were formal members of the battalions, the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion, the 49 Cav Squadron of the within 1st Cav, and also the 23 ACR, which was 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR, which was a battalion element, which is called a squadron in Cav terms. They were all mixed up. There were no more even homogeneous companies, and rarely was there even a homogeneous platoon. They were now mixed troops and vehicles of different companies, different platoons, even different squads intermixed, as they formed into these clumps of these company or several company-sized elements, where they seen one another and used hand gestures and basically shouting to try to relay and communicate information with one another, and they clumped up on this basis and were thus allowed to enter the area to be destroyed, as they had to move relatively slowly so they could stay within line of sight communications or earshot to be able to communicate adequately without even radio communications due to the electronic warfare jamming their redundant communication systems. All the while, the armored battalion had surrounded and since destroyed this grouping of over 200 reactionary armed civilians before then proceeding into the airport first, being followed behind by the mechanized infantry battalion and headquarters battalion, and the armored battalion was accompanied by a forward deployed firing battery of the air defense artillery battalion of the 38th Infantry Brigade, following very close behind them, even before the mechanized infantry, which was following behind the armored battalion. As they entered the airport, they had already engaged the security personnel and had forced them back into the airport park, which was connected to the airport on this side right here. There's a peninsula jutting out and around here. It's difficult to see on this map, but it's part of these forces here that then engage them on this side of the engagement. They wrap around slightly, and these forces engage them from this area down in here all the way up here. And they were engaging them from the southeast, while these guys engaged them from the general west and northwest. As the armored battalion had entered and captured the airport, they had fanned out their comprising companies, mostly their armored companies or their tank companies, essentially, in a perimeter-like arrangement with the platoons spreading out and forming a very hardened defensive perimeter to defend their new acquisition, along with the anti-tank company splitting up its 4 combat platoons as well, and posting them in different corners of the airport, with the armored infantry parking their vehicles and beginning to clear the buildings with their dismounted squads. As the fighting raged all throughout Waco and became rather hellish, even the airport was now being contested, as the city was beginning to resemble a cratered moon and rubblescape, as the PLA forces, whether armored and heavier mechanized infantry formations and combat engineers, or whether even the light infantry forces, were making their mark of destruction, supported by ample heavy artillery fire from 3 different types of artillery systems within each of the comprising subunits of the 68th PLA Group Army operating within the area, as they fired their enormous volumes of shells and rockets at the city in various points. At this particular battle space, in the airport fight, the earliest combat was against the security personnel forced into the airport park from the troops entering the airport. As they entered through the entryway and began to fan out, the tanks had opened fire, causing them to scatter, wiping some of them out before they even made it to the airport park. But those that made it into the airport park had been trying to fight back, as they were armed. These were just security personnel that were supposed to have been augmented by the 143rd and the troops of the 143rd entering the airport to protect it. But that never happened, and those troops were stuck downtown, causing these personnel to be all on their own and get wiped out completely, as these forces had entered the area in strength, firing their coax and turret machine guns at these personnel, now trying to hide amid the trees within the airport park. And even on some that were on the tarmac, they got cut down by these tanks as they began to fan out and then turned and faced outward to protect their new acquisition, as the armored infantry entered and began clearing the buildings along with the headquarters troops of the headquarters company. This was the entire headquarters company and their vehicles over the entire armored battalion, and this was the Air Defense Company and its HQ-11 air defense vehicles, which all had their own radar that equipped each firing platform of this air defense artillery battery, but they also had a larger radar set and command vehicle per each firing platoon, along with their headquarters platoon, which made this air defense company a complete company, as their headquarters vehicles were likewise spread out around them, and their MRAPs and their trucks, their supply trucks, their command vehicles, and they had the armored infantry companies, of which there were 2 within the armored battalion, parking their vehicles right here, including their headquarters vehicles along with them. And the armored company right here that was facing the entryway parked all of their vehicles here, while the 3 other armored companies that spread out their platoons here, this was a full company here, of their combat platoons, one tank platoon, another one, and another one. And they had their headquarters vehicles right here. And this was a platoon of AFT-10 anti-tank vehicles, which had 8 different pods on each vehicle for 8 HJ-10 anti-tank missiles. These were very powerful anti-tank systems, but they were long range. They didn't really have any short range weapons. They fired their anti-tank missiles, so anything that was within very short distance they would have a difficult time with, but the armor had spread out in front of them, and they could fire over the armor at enemies that were further afield, including even this close, but not if they were right up on them, which would require the troops manning the vehicles to have to use their small arms in that case. As the headquarters elements of this tank company here, starting with this platoon, and this platoon being another armored company and another platoon of the AFT-10s. This was the last platoon here. the last company here, this platoon, this platoon, this platoon, and this platoon. So that was the 3 tank companies, and the AFT-10s being the last platoon of them right here, with the other here, the other here, and the last one right there. As they had spread out, they had already wiped these personnel out right before the map opens up. And the armored infantry troops are moving throughout the area and clearing these different buildings, especially on this side right here, as this squad right here moving through this area is moving into this building between these 2 MRAPs that are parked outside facing their turrets in different directions, with this squad moving around, ultimately moving in to provide infantry support for these armored forces right here, as they're now being attacked through this wooded area as armed reactionary civilians had appeared and moved into this area adjacent to the airport. They were even off-map fighting over this way as well, which as this mechanized infantry battalion is moving into the area that was following behind the armored battalion, it now is going to move one company into the airport area, with its other comprising companies moving off map to clear areas adjacent to the airport, while the armored battalion holds it and has formed a defensive shell of armor around its new acquisition. And it's armored infantry troops moving into the area, this squad right here, moving here to provide infantry support to these platoons of armor, including this AFT-10 platoon right here, along with these MRAPs with their heavy W-85 12.7 millimeter machine guns firing out into the enemies, with the tanks taking small arms fire, which do absolutely nothing to them, but they're returning fire with Frag T shells and also heavy machine gun fire from their turret machine gunners, and also coax machine gun fire, which is still relatively potent and is shredding through these wooded areas with the Frag T shells, blasting trees into splintering debris, which is also quite destructive on human tissue. And these personnel are cut down quick, even though they had opened fire on these tanks and the rounds just bounced off. They took heavy return fire, with very few escaping with their lives from this area, but there were still those trying to open fire from within the woods in prone positions or behind rocks and other types of common cover and concealment you would find in a wooded area. While the infantry, this squad, moved around this air traffic control tower on this building right here and moved here to provide mechanized or armored infantry support to these platoons right here, along with this squad moving in between these tanks right here to provide support from here. And the other squad moved here to provide support in this area. There was already some spread out here. There was a squad right here and a squad moving in to reinforce them here. And as that was going on, across the way, on this peninsula, which connected to this area right here, as the lake widened out just below this area being connected to this neighborhood area right here, by this house that had a gazebo and a little boat launch, and this house right here, and this large carport garage, these personnel, these armed reactionary civilians, including in their technicals or their pickup trucks, including one that sped into the area and quickly dismounted 5 personnel that got tank shell fire and Frag T shell blasted the pickup truck into oblivion along with the dismounts. The tanks, although the AFT-10s and tanks were taking small arms fire, just bounced off of them, and even the AFT-10s could handle that. And the tanks just returned fire with tank shells. It was all ISR directed, as always, ISR and AI directed. Everything was vectored through AI, processing the real-time battlefield data and sending it back to the combat data links, everything that was seen on the quadcopter recon drones, all the way up to the WZ-7 high-altitude drone orbiting this specific area of the entire battle space. And also there was the CH-4A here, and the CH-4A here monitoring this side of the battlefield as well. And they all covered the area together from the high altitude, while all the different quadcopter drones of each and every vehicle and dismounted squad even monitored as a constellation this entire battle space in real time. Everything was updated in real time by the second through the ISR network of constellations of drones from low altitude all the way up to even higher altitude, even up to satellite. And all of it was different layers of ISR capabilities that all worked together to map out the battlefield in real time, which all got AI data processed and sent back in real time to the combat data links, helping commanders, even advising them on how best to deploy resources, troops, and use them in the battle. And it even also influenced the AI targeting data when certain loitering munitions were set on AI targeting modes, such as the CH-901A. Even the Russians could do it with their Lancet 3s. As these forces were taking heavy return fire from anti-tank missiles from HJ-10s that completely blew this shed and everybody around it into oblivion, as well as tank shells hitting at the same time and also impacting and shredding this large house into pieces and hitting out here amid these wooded areas on this peninsula, slamming into these pickups and blasting them and everybody around them. These three try to run, but an incoming shell just cuts them down. And the pickup truck that flew in and dismounted, they all got cut down by tank shells and anti-tank missiles from the HJ-10s, as they could hit right in here and beyond, as they were very long range. They had a 6.2 mile range, over twice what the TOW missile system had that the Americans had. Tanks firing from this way as well, vectoring their fire with the armor firing this way. As they took small arms fire, even this MRAP was dishing out heavy machine gun fire their direction, along with the heavy machine guns, coax machine guns, and tank gun fire, all being vectored in this area. I mean, this peninsula is being completely shredded up by tank shells and HJ-10 anti-tank missiles. There's nothing left over here. All the houses are blown to complete total oblivion. And over in this area, these buildings are already turned into rubble from the fighting that began. These tank shells and anti-tank missiles from the HJ-10s had completely blasted these homes into complete scrap and bricks, and there was nothing left of them. But the armed civilians moving into the area to attack them from this side, as all this is going on at the same time, this action here, and even off the map further up, where the mechanized infantry forces of this mechanized infantry battalion, minus one company entering to bolster the new FOB even more, were going around to clear enemy forces that were on the land that widened out off map. And the armored forces were facing down their attackers. They had already wiped out all these personnel over here and were fighting these personnel all at the same time that were attacking them from this direction, including even off map. Even as they had other armored infantry squads moving in from their now parked vehicles, moving through and clearing this terminal building out, along with all of these different hangars that were part of the airport as well. Squad moving up here. Squads and headquarters platoon elements outside of their vehicles. Headquarters company elements outside of their vehicles over the entire armored battalion. You have a squad moving here, temporarily pausing, and then moving around the building to behind these tanks that were taking fire to reinforce them with dismounted armored infantry support, laying down small arms fire while the tanks fired their shells and volleys, as well as heavy machine guns and coax machine guns. These guys were there to make sure that nobody somehow strayed through the fence in some kind of crazy mass human wave attack and Molotov these vehicles. So these guys are standing by to keep enemy forces off vehicles. And at the opening of the map, before this Wing Loom 2 combat drone even entered this area, it had already fired 2 HJ-10 anti-tank missiles at enemy targets. As you can see, the smoke trails go back, which is an icon indicating that the missiles were fired further back as this drone was flying through the area, and it began to leave and to go and support other combat going on after it launched its few missiles into these enemies that were congregating just outside the airport on this side. For the future of this airport, it was to be widened out a bit. It was to have some of the fencing knocked down and widened out and expanded to become a mega fob. It was already big enough to accommodate a few battalions or more, but the plan was for the occupation to turn this into a mega fob because the runways were already adequate enough and long enough, as this was a roughly over 1 mile by 1 mile area of the airport itself, as this map was a 1.5 by 1.5 mile area. The airport itself, big enough to handle all these forces, could handle more, but they needed to expand it for parking so that all of these airstrips could eventually be used by even larger aircraft. And that would be for ferrying in and out troops, for troop rotations and supplies. So for now, they were holding the airport until victory was attained in this particular battle over Waco, where then it could be converted into a mega fob. But very reminiscent of aspects of Iraq, this fob, or soon-to-be fob, was being attacked by partisan/insurgent/guerrilla-like elements, and they were trying to keep them at bay. They were coming in strong in a relatively large attack with almost 500 total when counting those attacking on this side and this side against the forces now arrayed upon this airport. As the squad moved up here to clear the terminal buildings and hold position inside of them and defend from inside these buildings, the drone firing the HJ-10 anti-tank missiles from the drone at these forces, along with the HJ-10s fired from the AFT-10 vehicles and the tank shells, the heavy machine gun fire, even fire from dismounted troops from the armored infantry forces, heavy machine gun fire from MRAPs even, of the headquarters platoon vehicles, and also more. I mean, the dismounts were firing everything from Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade, anti-personnel, and anti-tank ammunition at these buildings that still were not quite yet destroyed, but were becoming destroyed as shells flew directly into them after flying into and destroying these buildings in conjunction with the anti-tank missiles that landed back here and destroyed these buildings, and the ones flying in from the drone hitting other buildings further afield. These were all homes and small businesses. This neighborhood was being completely wrecked already this early in the fighting. And the forces were also firing HJ-10 wire-guided anti-tank missiles that were man-portable and could be fired from an individual soldier. I mean, this area was being completely slaughtered. And as these forces ran in to try and lay down an attack, they just got repulsed by all the heavy fire. I mean, it became too much between the MRAP firing its heavy machine gun. Some of them were trying to fight from rubbled positions, and they tended to last the longest. But as you can see, this area is covered in red. It's difficult in the lighting, but this area is covered in red right here. They were all eventually KIA'd, although those behind emerged from the rubble, trying to move into this rubble to fire and get closer and closer. They were cut down, as this encapsulated green arrow in red indicates. All the enemies that were coming out from behind these buildings and rubble to move up and try to get closer, ostensibly to use Molotovs, as that was the only anti-armor option they even had available at this point in the fighting, although some would end up getting their hands on some rocket-propelled grenades, which would come out of a situation where a Kaczynski-like figure would lay down a certain improvised thing that would essentially wipe out some of the enemy and allow for very fast-moving individuals to move in and pick up some of these implements. But that would happen in another part of the battlefield, not here, as these forces here were well in control of this facility, and they had so much firepower in one spot, as in the whole entire battalion. Even a forward-deployed air defense company was here. Air defense battery. And these HQ-11s, they had a close-in weapons Gatling gun system, which could actually even be used in a ground attack role, sort of like the SPAAA 95s, these short-range air defense weapons with their quad 25 autocannons that could likewise be manually operated and pointed and fired at ground targets. Although the FN6s were strictly for air defense, the quad 25s could be used against air or ground targets, as there was a manual option. There was an automatic radar targeting option where the radar moved the turret against targets and aimed the weapon, but there was also the manual option so they could fire at enemy targets. As the HQ-11s were a slightly bigger but still very mobile system compared to the SPAAA 95s, they were still fully capable of using their close-in weapon system at land-based targets, but they were strictly here just set up to guard the installation from any type of air threats whatsoever at all, if any even existed this early on, because by this point, it was so early on in the fighting, as this map opens up at 1:30 a.m., the U.S. Air Force was still in the process of being destroyed this early on in the fighting. So they had to spread out their air defense assets in such a manner to where they protected the troops as a matter of SOP. And the HQ-11s, as well as even the HQ-6As, had the capability of intercepting enemy rocket artillery and also, in some instances, even mortars and shells, especially in the case of the HQ-11 due to its close-in weapon system. These were very advanced air defense systems. And they could intercept mortars, shells, rockets, and the HQ-6A could intercept rockets. And also close-in air targets from drones to helicopters all the way to low-flying aircraft. And these could definitely do that as well as it related to the HQ-11s and the HQ-6As. Both of them were very good for that. But the HQ-11 was a bit better than the HQ-6A. And these forces, after having completely engaged and destroyed all these buildings, all these personnel on this side, had done this at the same time that the mechanized infantry forces were moving off the map, beginning to clear those on this side off the map, as well as these forces finishing these off in the woods here, these personnel in the woods, these armed reactionary civilians that thought they were going to sneak in the woods and try and launch a sneak attack, get real close and launch a sneak attack, but they failed and they were completely cut down as a result. As they were spotted moving through this area, they had been seen before they had even entered the woods. It was well understood. As the ISR assets spotted them going in the woods, it was well understood by these forces that they were being approached, and they opened fire and just drenched this entire wooded area with fragmentation shells, these Frag-T tank shells that completely shredded this woodland into oblivion, and it was going to be cleared out anyway and expanded with the FOB expansion that was part of the future occupation plans for the area. There's all these different forces of these different companies that comprise the Armored Battalion and, of course, the forward deployed Air Defense Battery from the Air Defense Battalion, and the soon-to-arrive entire Headquarters Battalion that would move into the area, along with one company from the Mechanized Infantry, with the other companies fanning out to provide an additional layer of security around the area, as it was well understood that more reactionary armed civilians were appearing. The forces here put up a very adequate defense and rapidly destroyed their opponents, as their opponents lacked any real actionable intelligence and very poor coordination due to a lack of adequate communications. They gave it their best effort, but not lacking any heavy weapons, actionable intelligence to operate on the enemy, knowing exactly when and where and the capabilities of the enemy and where they were at any given moment, except for when they could see them and what they could see of them, put them at a severe disadvantage against an enemy that had full heavy weapons dominance, full technology dominance, full ISR dominance, full dominance in armored phalanxes that could completely form a hedgehog-like defense around an area, and prevent enemies from being able to infiltrate altogether, with the armored infantry plugging up whatever gaps there might even be, if there were even any. But the ISR network prevented any enemies from even being able to sneak up too close within an open space. They would need to utilize the best possible cover available and concealment in the form of basically coniferous pine or thick wooded canopies that were thick enough to obscure infrared signatures, or areas that were covered up deep enough that they could sneak through them, such as deep rubble or tunnel systems, and get in that way. But there were none, so these forces had been horribly mauled and gored. Hundreds of armed reactionary civilians, hundreds of men had been killed trying to take on the PLA over the airport. And for the American military, things weren't much better, as in this particular battle, the PLA suffered no casualties, as they had every advantage here, and there were no flukes in this particular battle, unlike in the previous installment where Molotovs had been thrown before there was even the chance to wipe those personnel out before they got to throw those, as the loitering munitions were very close, but weren't close enough to prevent them from doing that at that particular time. It's war, and even there's going to be gaps within a near perfect system, such as where an incident like that can occur. And the reason the PLA had extremely low casualties compared to the Americans during this entire invasion was due to their superiority with all these systems and weapons. But, again, there were times where there were gaps in the system, just like there is in any system. And sometimes people were wise enough or clever enough to exploit that, or they had the opportunity to do it, even if it didn't involve them being clever. They took the opportunity if it presented itself. Although these reactionary armed civilians were definitely not as wise as the armed Americans that went into the wilderness or underground, both literally and figuratively, to regroup, reorganize, and begin to delegate responsibilities to people that actually had professions, that were experts in their fields, and even delegating leaders that actually had leadership qualities and skills and experience, training, and also training cadre that could train up the untrained to be real, capable troops in the field. As many of these reactionary armed civilians did not have that, not all of them. There were some. There were some ex-military, there were some ex-security type personnel and others that had training or experience, but most of them didn't in this particular case. There were militias that had better training equipment in general terms than did these regular reactionary armed civilians. They were of a different stripe, and they were a little bit better prepared, but even then, due to the lack of communications, if they chose to be reactionary and react right away and go pick a fight, they were going to lose, especially due to an invasion force coming in with full force, everything blazing. They weren't in a more relaxed patrol policing tempo or occupation tempo. They were in a full-on invasion where they were coming in looking for a fight with everything they had. It was not very wise to be one of them while this type of thing was happening. That's why the forces that had gone underground to prepare were the more wise of those armed civilians than the reactionary armed civilians that went looking for a fight immediately when they had no advantages at all. And they lost for it, and they paid everything, including their lives, because they were all cut down immediately. While the more intelligent went and got prepared for what they were facing and waited for the enemy to relax their tempo of operations. As these very powerful forces wouldn't begin to settle in until after they had won their victory. Then they would begin a lesser, more low-intensity tempo of operations. And that would be the opportunity when those that were in hiding and preparing would have more of a chance of even affecting any type of real changes. And it wouldn't be easy even then. It would still be extremely difficult, and casualties would be extremely high. And many people would perish in the millions over the years of occupation. Many would perish. As the airport was now under complete and total PLA control, with the Mechanized Infantry Battalion, minus a company it shed off into the facility to bolster with infantry support these armored forces, as the 2 armored infantry companies, although they were more than enough, it was just SOP to provide more dismounted infantry after they would drop them off from their vehicles to patrol the area and make sure that everything was 100% secure before it would be turned into a FOB. As the armored infantry had mostly already achieved this, the 1 mechanized infantry company moving into the airport would just be a redundancy, but it would be done anyway, as the others would clear the area outside of the airport and make sure that all enemies had been KIA'd, or if those were WIA'd and still laying there or bleeding out, that they could be rescued and given medical attention and taken POW. But in this particular instance, they'd all been thoroughly wiped out and annihilated as they tried to brazenly attack these forces holding the Waco Regional Airport, with everything surrounding from upscale homes to residential neighborhoods to the airport park to the areas to the southeast, completely and thoroughly destroyed by tank shells and anti-tank missiles and more. The airport would remain in PLA hands for the duration of the occupation. In the next video of this hypothetical invasion documentary series that depicts 4th generation warfare doctrines with real facts and figures, real vehicles, everything, real units, all of it. The next combat occurrence within this battle that will be explored was the fighting that occurred with a kill box that formed when these mixed American forces began to enter the Waco area from the south and began to spread out, trying to make contact with the 143rd, who was now finding itself increasingly trapped and embattled within the downtown area and heavily shelled, as the artillery forces of the different elements within this battle space had morbidly shelled and rocketed the downtown area into complete abject rubbled ruination. As the fighting would remain relatively heavy even in the rubble, as this would now become a cratered and smashed battlefield where rubble would be repurposed as fighting positions for the defenders. And they would attempt, within these rubbled positions, to hold out as long as possible. And would even manage to hold out for almost 2 entire days. Even with the external forces passing safely up I-35 while they remained trapped and surrounded in the downtown area, with the externals moving right on up past them. As I-35 would be by then fully cleared, as well as the airport, as the Waco Regional being held after being seized, as well as the TSTC airport being captured and seized early on without much of a fight by the Independent Headquarters Battalion and Independent Support Battalion over the entire 288th Light Infantry Division. More to come in the next video.